Can you remember some of the field trips that you went on in school, in elementary or middle school or high school? Let me hear a few examples. Okay. Coca-Cola factory. Hershey. Okay, great. There's so many. I did a lot of those too. I went on trips of historical significance, museums, and sometimes even state parks or fun attractions. But since I went to Roman Catholic schools early in my life, we also had some variations on these typical field trips. For example, I recall us piling into a big yellow school bus and attending a movie together. Such thrilling cinematic features, such as the Song of Bernadette, which portrays the story of Bernadette, who reportedly experienced 18 visions of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Lourdes, France. The movie opens with a scene of the 14-year-old Bernadette being shamed by her teacher, Sister Valzou, for falling behind in her studies because of her asthma. That afternoon, while fetching firewood with her sister Marie and a friend, Bernadette begins to experience these appearances of a beautiful lady dressed in white, who it turns out is Mary, Blessed Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, as I look back on that story of that film, I realize that Bernadette did show old Sister Valzou her place. Touché! And there is a subtext in the movie that 3 children from poor families gained enormous power to bring the whole system of the church and society in disarray and subversiveness because of their reported visions and the fact that this beautiful lady in white would appear to them mere children. And of course, there was our field trip to see The Sound of Music, about a young postulate or a candidate for the women's religious life or nun who isn't quite cutting it in the convent, and so they send her to be governess of 7 children of a retired naval officer. Now, if that wouldn't have her running back and getting back in shape to go to the convent, I don't know what would. So these movies and others were part of our field trips. I wonder now, given the restrictions that were placed on nuns back then, whether this was the only time those dear sisters got to go to a movie. You know, dragging dozens of snot-nosed, rambunctious children along with them. I wonder, I feel a little compassion for them now. Then there were the field trips that we went on in 5th grade, which had a different kind of slant to them. In the Roman Catholic school that I was attending, we were actually taken on field trips to other churches and a synagogue. I believe that our Catholic religious educators were trying to create bridges of understanding for us as a burgeoning ecumenical movement was being launched at the time that also saw more cooperation across denominations in the work for civil rights. As a 5th grader, I was intrigued. These field trips with my Catholic school religious education class, because up until now, we'd been told we weren't allowed to visit non-Catholic churches. Anyone else had that experience as a child? Okay. So it was an adventure. It felt like an adventure to finally break through the island taboo. I recall that we visited what we called Protestant churches. That was the extent of our vocabulary at the time. And a Jewish temple. On the day we visited a Baptist church, I was immediately fascinated by what I observed in the front of the sanctuary. Whoa, wow. Look, they have a swimming pool. Lawrence, said the nun, in a monotone voice as she stared through me and down at me with her laser beam eyes. I melted on the spot as my fascination turned into embarrassment. Obviously, I had said something wrong. And then the Baptist minister laughed out loud at my comment, and I felt instantly redeemed, or shall I say saved, on the spot. He appreciated, I believe, my looking at things with my fresh, naive eyes. And my embarrassment lifted, and I stood just a little taller in that moment. He went on to explain that in their church, when they baptized people, their whole body went into the water. We don't sprinkle, we dunk, he said. And he used this to explain to our class of fifth graders why they were called a Baptist church. I nodded with a strong confidence as my gaze fixated on that baptismal pool in front of me and away from the piercing eyes of the nun that I could feel. You know, it seems like that I've been continuing these field trips the rest of my life. They started in fifth grade, and they've continued ever since. So when I was a senior in high school, for example, I was in a social studies seminar class, and I developed a research project in which I interviewed all the different clergy in the town that we were living in. My attraction to Unitarian Universalism in late adolescence began as a field trip to a UU church. And because I felt that I could continue to explore, I didn't have to feel that my arrival in a UU church meant my exploring would have to cease. In fact, we do affirm in our purposes and principles the practice of a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. In much of my national work, first on the staff of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and then with a few cross-denominational organizations, I often sought my counterpoints in other religious traditions and worked with not just UU congregations, but Jewish congregations and congregations of many Protestant denominations. I've taught in seminaries that had Christian and Jewish and Muslim students, students from black churches, progressive congregations, and conservative ones. So my field trips have continued in that religious terrain that is so rich and diverse. Now, over the years, I've also dragged my spouse to a variety of religious services in various religious traditions. I have been called a religious tourist. Even as I feel grounded in Unitarian Universalism, I still am drawn to understand and appreciate the various ways that people seek what is holy and express their yearnings and their longings for the holy connection and for the common good across all of our differences. In our culture, and particularly in the arena of religion, there's a tendency towards exclusionary thinking, in which we claim our viewpoint is right, and we exclude those who don't agree with us. Let's all try that movement. One. Sometimes we do it in much more subtle ways. I have personally benefited from the perspective of Ken Wilber, who takes an integral perspective which recognizes that as persons and cultures and even religions, that we are often, as he says, transcending and including. In a nutshell, this might mean that instead of trying to pit one viewpoint against another, we aim to include the valid features of all viewpoints into the most inclusive model of which we can conceive. For Wilber, this process of transcending the limitations of one way of looking at things and including the partial truths that might be contained is what occurs in our own personal growth and our cultural development and the expansion, the expansion of our consciousness beyond the I'm right and you're wrong tendency so prevalent today. Now, if we took the time, I suspect each of us could trace some of this pattern of transcending former perspectives and including some of their particles of truth as we've grown in our own personal and spiritual lives. You suspect that's true? This same growth dynamic exists within Unitarian Universalism at its best as well. We incorporate into our spiritual lives what makes sense to us, and we know that we will, as we develop, also transcend some understandings as we grow and develop and mature to something new in our understanding. In spite of whatever exceptions might occur, I still want to declare that there's something in our spiritual DNA that propels us to keep a curious posture, to be open to diverse experiences, and to continue to deepen and to develop our understandings. Our workshop today after church, Diversity with Dogma, Without Dogma, with author Gil Cosby, who's here, I suspect will invite us into similar process of observing how when we acknowledge, understand, and learn from inevitable differences among us, that we can transcend the personal and interpersonal limitations that bind us. There's something about Unitarian Universalism at its best that invites us into this integral perspective. And what I discovered recently is when we look more fully into our family tree, that we have a richer story to tell about ourselves than we usually do. Depending upon when you entered into this faith community, you may have a certain understanding of who Unitarian Universalists are, a certain understanding of our history and of our heritage. And yet our roots go deep and our branches reach much wider than we usually acknowledge. The story that we usually tell about Unitarian Universalism is something like this. We teach about our New England roots, the pilgrims who risked everything for their own religious freedom, the Boston reformers and literati who advanced social reform, the 20th century religious humanists who reverenced science and worked for civil rights and call us to care for the world. Sound familiar? While all this is true, it's only part of our story. Such a story only captures part of our family tree and leaves out other parts of our family tree. I found this distinction in narrative therapy very useful. It's the distinction between a thin story and a thick story. So let me explain what I mean. In a thin story, we tend to select out events from our life, for example, to create a story that tells a neat, compact version of our events. A thin story can be one that's tragic or triumphant, or can oftentimes be limiting. I believe this typical story that we tell about our history as Unitarian Universalism is an example of a thin story. It selects certain things, but leaves out so much else. It is a triumphant story about freedom and reason and tolerance. It fits well within our dominant narrative of who we are a coming out of people, we are leaving behind people, leaving behind traditional faiths or the faiths we were raised in, and we move towards ever more enlightenment and eloquence. Let me see your eloquence. You can do a little bit better. Let me see your eloquence. Great. I knew it was a true story. Yet when we broaden the events that we draw upon to tell the story about ourselves, when we venture to look into our broader Unitarian religious history in particular, we may thicken the story, which I believe can often enrich our understanding in ways that a thin story never can. So this is my aim this morning, to thicken our story so that we are drawing more on our family tree and our ancestry as a religious movement as a way that provides a deeper understanding of who it is that we are. In broadening our story, thickening our story to our fuller family tree, I believe we're able to claim our religious identity in ways that are just ripe for this time, this moment in which we are in. In order to thicken our story, I've turned to some of the historical research from Unitarian Universalist historian Susan Ritchie in her book, Children of the Same God, The Historical Relationship Between Unitarianism, Judaism, and Islam. What Ritchie does is allow us to understand some of our Unitarian roots in Europe and recover some of our own defining characteristic as a religious movement that engages in multi-religious interchange and a broader sense of our heritage and our identity. We often think of ourselves as not being into theology that much, right? Right? In fact, a former professor at Harvard Divinity School still likes to tell a story when he was teaching a doctorate-level course and invited students in the course to write a paper on their theology to undergird their research on a particular social ethics issue. He says a UU student immediately spoke up in a loud voice in the class and said, "Oh, I'm Unitarian Universalist. We don't do theology." It's a story that gets some laughs, and I also tend to cringe. I really tend to cringe when I've heard him tell this story more than once. I feel embarrassed by how we sometimes show up in the world in ways that actually belie our religious heritage and our religious practice. Obviously, we may not do theology in some of the conventional ways, yet we do reflect on the big questions about the nature of the holy, human nature, evil and suffering, and our role in healing and liberating the world. That is theology, my friend, when we're doing that kind of deep reflection. For a group that doesn't do theology, oddly enough, our name is one of the few, if not the only one, that uses a theological term to define ourselves, Unitarian and Universalists. I only have time this morning to focus on the Unitarian part. That name Unitarian was hard-won, and we should not carry it lightly or blithely. By calling ourselves Unitarian, we have distinguished ourselves in some of the theological debates and battles that have defined religious history in the West. As you may know, ready for a little history tour? Just say yes, thank you. As you may know, the first 3 centuries of Christianity, there were many ways of understanding Jesus, who he was, what the purpose of his work was, how human or how divine he was. And given all these various points of view among Christians, Emperor Constantine called together all the bishops of his empire together in 325 in the Common Era to stay in one of his nice palaces in Nicaea and to resolve once and for all by a vote who Jesus was. In fact, some think that the early church could have lived with this diversity of opinion for a long time if Constantine did not feel like he had to intervene. Constantine felt that in order to rule his kingdom and to make Christianity the state religion, he needed there to be consistency and agreement around what Christianity was. It was this Council of Nicaea in 325 in the Common Era that helped to move Christianity to what became known as the Trinity, an understanding that God the Father, God the Son, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit were actually 3 persons in one triune God. Don't ask me to explain that. Trinitarian became our understanding, became the understanding of what God was, what God is. The Nicene Creed is still recited in some Christian churches today. Those who did not agree with this decision, who understood Jesus as a teacher and a prophet, as maybe of God, but not necessarily one being with the Father, including Bishop Arius, were considered at that point on heretics. Here's the thing. The definition of a Trinitarian God not only had theological implications, it also, as Ritchie points out, had implications for Christians' relationships with Jews at the time. From that point on, it can be construed that the Christian God, this triune God, and the Jewish God were not the same. Bishop Arius and others who were then considered anti-Trinitarian were considered heretics. Not only was this a theological issue, again, for many of them, it was also an issue of breaking their relationship and their bond with the Jewish community that they actually had at that time. Documents from this period also show that Constantine had some anti-Semitic motivation towards this unifying Christianity and this Trinitarian perspective. Now, fast forward to the 16th century. Aren't you glad we didn't do all the centuries in between? Ritchie points out in her research the issues of this division also becomes a relevant part of our own fuller history about ourselves, our fuller family history as Unitarians. Unitarian Christians, our ancestors in Europe, during that time, I quote, resisted establishing a Christian identity over and against Muslims and Jews, and instead fostered religious views and practices that expressed kinship and mutual respect among these three traditions. For them, it was more than a theological issue. It was breaking a sense of kinship and relationship with Muslims and Christians at that time by setting apart their God from the God of their neighbors. The most remarkable example of this cooperation and collaboration among Christians, Muslims, and Jews was during the 700-year period in Spain and North Africa when under Muslim rule, Christians, Muslims, and Jews coexisted in peaceful interaction that produced a splendid flowering of the arts, the architecture, music, and religious interchange and scholarship. This Andalusian period, that many of you may have heard of, is described fully in the book The Ornament of the World by Maria Rosa Menocal, which describes how Muslims, Jews, and Christians from the early 8th through the late 15th centuries managed, for the most part, with some interruptions, to sustain relationships that enabled them to coexist, collaborate, and to flourish. That is an inspiring story for us to tell in our time, I believe. Michael Servetus, a Spanish physician and theologian, became one of the key figures in Unitarian history in Europe, and he was aware of and influenced by this context in Spain when Jews, Muslims, and Christians learned each other's languages, read each other's scriptures, celebrated with one another. Servetus was anti-Trinitarian, better said as Unitarian, as were his Jewish and Muslim counterparts. All believed in one God, which they considered the same God. Following me so far? Okay. Servetus' motivation for taking on the Trinity was his concern that the doctrine unnecessarily separates Christianity from Judaism and Islam. And in his book, The Errors of the Trinity, he makes the case for why the doctrine of the Trinity is not in the Scriptures. He praises Muslims for accepting Jesus as a prophet and wonders why Christians cannot return the favor with Muhammad. It is Servetus' book that emboldened others to also loosen the grip that the doctrine of the Trinity had on other Christians at the time. So from Poland to Lithuania to Transylvania, anti-Trinitarian groups, Unitarian groups, arose to declare a Unitarian understanding of God, to honor the connection and the kinship they had in some cases with Jews and Muslims. In Transylvania, which is today part of Romania, yeah, it's the home of Dracula as well, and I've been there. And they actually have little tourist things to kind of see Dracula's castle if you're interested. But you can also see lots of Unitarian churches in the villages of Transylvania. Unitarians found a home there and a refuge for those who were being persecuted because of their Unitarian perspective in other parts of Europe. The historic Edict of Torda in 1568 granted religious toleration in Transylvania, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire. And it was able to come about, Ritchie argues, because there was already a culture of Muslim toleration, a toleration of differing religious groups. And so it is the political and legal influence of the Ottoman Empire that prepared the way for the Edict of Torda, as much as the influence of Francis David, a Unitarian leader, and other radical reformers. So this non-Trinitarian theology of the Transylvanian Unitarians was viewed as corresponding exactly with the unity of God in the Quran and in the Jewish scriptures. In fact, some of our Unitarian ancestors in Transylvania adapted some of the Jewish customs in their own practices. So when we own this part of our history, we see that our story is much thicker and broader than the one we typically tell in the United States. This Unitarian heritage of cooperating and advocating for multi-religious understanding and cooperation is part of the story that we must tell about ourselves. Unitarians, in other words, preserved some of the cross-fertilization of ideas and some of the kinship with Jews and Muslims and Unitarian Christians at a time when some parts of Europe Christians were persecuting, exiling, and diminishing not just the religions of Judaism and Islam, but also the people. So why does this matter? Because we need to claim our multi-religious characteristics that have formed and shaped who we are from our European heritage. Our DNA includes a solidarity with those of other faiths who might otherwise be persecuted and ostracized. More and more we are seeing Jewish and Muslims and progressive Christians who are feeling attracted to our Unitarian Universalist approach to religion. Rather than feeling they must drop their heritage, we may encourage them with the integrity that is actually part of our own fuller religious heritage to be part of our community. And interspirituality also means that we may find some practices that speak to our common humanity that come from other religious traditions. I know that when I was grieving the loss of my first spouse when I was 39 years old, I felt attracted to and comforted by some of the Jewish practices and rituals of mourning. I found them personally meaningful. There was something healing in these practices that counteract our culture's general tendency to get over grief quickly and efficiently. However, to acknowledge that you are mourning, to receive the company of others, to light a candle and be in the blessing of the memories of the one who has died, these transcend the particulars and include a common, universal human need. Since that time in my life, when I've been invited to join with Jewish friends who are also sitting in mourning, sitting Shiva, I understand the meaningfulness of this period of not having to be alone in your grief and of being held in the hearts of others into experiencing tangible care. As we confront global issues, it will require of us to do more and to collaborate more across religious communities, as we are already doing in many cases. It will require that we seek common ground and common cause with those who may have distinctly different religious beliefs and traditions than our own, and yet who are willing to join together to address the threats to democracy, the climate emergency, housing and immigration, hunger, racial injustice, and threats to women's health and LGBTQ rights. So as I conclude, I want to imagine that we are going on a field trip together. A field trip into the future of Unitarian Universalism. A Unitarian Universalism that claims a fuller story about itself. A story that includes the way that we may have overcome some of the limiting beliefs of the religion of our upbringing, and a story that tells of the importance of multi-religious interaction, kinship and cooperation, of our ancestors and solidarity with those who otherwise might be excluded or persecuted. Let's tell a thicker story as we move into our future. And if we were to fast forward on that field trip 10 years from now, I'm wondering what you will see. I'm wondering what you will imagine. And I invite you to enter that imagination